Hello and welcome. My name is Biagio Mazza, Pastoral Associate at St. Sabina Parish in Belton, Missouri, and I'm here to welcome you to another Do You Know series question. We continue our series on the evolution of Christianity from Judaism, and today's Do You Know question is, do you know the beginnings of anti-Semitism and its horrendous history? It's important to remember that the split occurred among Jews over the person of Jesus. Some Jews accepted, others didn't. This clash eventually led to a split, especially when the Jews who accepted Jesus started to welcome Gentiles into their midst. And as more and more Gentiles entered into the picture, the Jews who had followed Jesus and the Christian movement at least started to lose its Jewish roots and its Jewish foundations. And all of a sudden you have a split that leads to a very negative tensions between Christians and Jews. This is evidenced very early on, even after the destruction of the temple, in which Christians see the destruction of the temple as a fitting punishment for Jews who had rejected Christ, and not only rejected him, but actually collaborated with the Romans to put him to death. And so very early on, we had the accusation of what is known as deicides. Jews are accused of the killing of Christ. Along with this came the notion that Jesus was not really, even though he was Jewish, he ultimately rejected Judaism. So he was no longer seen as Jewish, but primarily as Christian. He rejected Judaism and established a new people of God, namely the Christians, who had a good number of Gentiles as part of that group. This convergence of ideas led to a theological tenet that existed for over 20 centuries, and it wasn't really rejected by Catholicism until the Second Vatican Council. This theological tenet is known as supersessionism. And supersessionism has a number of components to it, but it starts off with the whole idea that God's revelation in Jesus superseded God's revelation to Israel, and therefore that the New Testament fulfills the Old, and that the church replaces Judaism as God's people. This tenet also holds that Judaism is obsolete. God's covenant with Judaism is now null and void, and God has established a new covenant with new people of God, namely the church. In this particular theological tenet, Judaism is seen as completely legalistic, and it's replaced by the love teachings of Jesus. And then the Jews themselves are seen as completely stubborn. Stubborn in the sense that they refuse to listen to the prophets that God has sent to them about the direction of their covenant, as well as blind. They refuse to see the prophecies or understand the Old Testament prophecies regarding Jesus. They did not understand, and they refused to apply them to Jesus. And ultimately, the ultimate accusation that started very early on was the deicide accusation. And the deicide accusation is that they put Christ to death. As a result of this, horrendous history develops of relationship between Christians and Jews. Once Christians came into power, especially with Constantine in the year 312, where they were legitimized as a religion of the empire, and eventually the only religion of the empire, Christians started to actively persecute and even kill Jews for what they had done to Christ, the deicide charge. And this history went on for centuries. You see this in many places throughout the early church, but also very strong in the Middle Ages. You will notice things like the ghettos were established by the church to separate the Jews from the Christians so that they would have no interaction with one another. You also see this in the special clothing that Jews had to wear when they appeared in public, so that the Christians could easily identify them and avoid them, or even actively persecute them and maltreat them and so on. Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice typifies the relationship between Christians and Jews, especially over the issue of money and banking and so on. And many scholars also affirm that, this kind of attitude over the centuries ultimately was one of the key causes for the Holocaust under a madman like Hitler and so on. Now, all of this led to, as I said, 20 centuries of massive persecution of the Jews, and only for Catholicism anyway, only with the Second Vatican Council did we reject all of these tenets of supersessionism and claim that God still has a legitimate covenant with the Jews, and that we ought to respect that and acknowledge that, and that no one can that we cannot accuse Jews for having killed Christ. And so that's only with the Second Vatican Council, and we will return during this series to those tenets later on. But it's important to realize that we have a horrendous history of our relationship with Judaism, and that we need to respond to the Second Vatican Council's call to change our minds and hearts with regards to that. If you're interested at all in reading anything with regards to the history of anti-Semitism, especially from a Catholic perspective and written by a Catholic priest, I would suggest a book called The Anguish of the Jews by Edward H. Flannery. One of the best books and resources on the market with regards to this horrendous history. So I hope this has helped to explain just a bit of the origins of anti-Semitism and its horrendous history, and I hope you will return again to more Do You Know series questions to explore more about the evolution of Christianity from Judaism. Thank you very much.
The opening slide of this Do You Know series video features ecclesia and synagoga, which in Latin means church and synagogue. This pair personifies the church and the Jewish synagogue, that is to say the Jewish religion, and are found in medieval Christian art. The two figures are shown as women, both usually young and attractive. Ecclesia is generally adorned with a crown, chalice, and cross-topped staff, looking confidently forward. In contrast, synagoga is blindfolded and drooping, carrying a broken lance, possibly an allusion to the holy lance that stabbed Christ, and the tablets of the law or Torah that may be slipping from her hand. The staff and spear may have pennants flying from them. In images of the crucifixion, ecclesia may hold a chalice that catches the blood spurting from the side of Christ. She often holds a chalice as an attribute in other contexts. Attributes carried by synagoga include a sheep or goat, or just its head, signifying Old Testament sacrifice, in contrast to ecclesia's chalice, which represents the Christian Eucharist. If not blindfolded, synagoga usually looks down.